Okay, are we ready with the translation? Okay, thank you. All right, well, that was all an introduction so far, actually. Just a very long introduction. So we are going to start delving into some of those things over the rest of this whole seminar. And this next session, we're going to pick up on the one that June introduced on family, and we're going to talk about that a little more in depth because it's such an important aspect of church planting because you're on a journey together as a family. But I also wanted to acknowledge to you know right now is that we all know that not everybody in this room is currently planting a church. Some of you might have just been planting a church for a while. Some of you might be at the beginning of the journey of church planting. Some of you might be preparing to church plant. Many of you might even be thinking, what is this church planting thing? I'm just here to get information. So we know that people are all along the spectrum, and so that's fine. But as we go through some of the exercises, and we're going to be doing a lot more interaction now in all these sessions coming up than we have in the introductory ones, put yourself in the mind as if you were a church planter anyway, okay? Can you do that? Can you just use your imagination and think, okay, I'm still maybe not convinced of church planting, or I have no idea why, if maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But can you think about, well, if I were a church planter, or if I were considering it, that's how we really want you to think through the questions and answer them. And I think you'll find that that's actually a very valuable exercise for you in your own personal processing about church planting. So we just encourage you to do that as we go through this. And we understand that people are coming from a variety of different backgrounds, and so feel free to even ask questions from your own perspective. That's fine too. So we want to serve you the best we can. And we really want to help you move ahead and figure out what's next for you in God's calling on your life and on your ministry. Okay? Is that okay? Good. So, all right. Well, our next session is family preparation. And so we want to talk a little bit about the church planter's family. So your first slide says, one of the most significant factors in predicting success in church planting is the health and the cooperation of the church planter's wife and family and children, right? So we're assuming that the church planter, the church planting pastor is a man, and we're assuming that in this scenario he's married and he has children, right? Not all of us are in that exact case, but this is a very common one. So the question here before us is, what issues related to your family are on your mind as you enter the church planting experience? So think about that a minute, because I'm going to ask for some responses. Okay, so what issues related to your family are on your mind as you enter the church planting experience? So again, if you're not entering it, pretend you are. So pretend that you're going to be planting a church. What kinds of things might be a concern to you? So I want to hear some responses now. So pretend you're a church planter. If you are a church planter, then you are a church planter. And as you're going into wherever you're going to go to plant your church, surely you have some family-related concerns. Can you tell me some of those? Time pressures. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, the time you spent to planting or doing whatever is related to that, and time that you actually spent with the family itself because you love it.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah. So how do you balance your time between church planting is all consuming and your family? You should be a great husband and father. So great. What other concerns are on your mind as you enter the church planting experience that are family related? Kurt.
Aging parents.
Okay. Yeah. Very good one. You might have parents that will be far from you, but they're going to be entering the later stages of life and have some concerns that you are responsible for. Great. What else?
Children age.
Children?
Age.
Age? The age of your children?
Yeah. They're teenagers.
Okay.
Very sensitive to changes.
Very good. Yeah, what stage of life are your children at too? I'm trying to repeat the questions because I know it's being taped, okay? So, so if you have young children, how does that impact their lives? If they're teenagers, are they going to go along with this deal? Yeah, great. What else? Yes, sir.
Lack of programming such as is at the current church that we're in for our children. So we're going to be a new church, but there won't be a Sunday school, there won't be youth ministry, there won't be... How will it be for our children, and how will we make up for the lack of those things in their lives?
Wow. You sound like you've thought about this a lot, sir.
On occasion.
Oh, okay, right. Yes, yes. So very good, though, yes. You're going to to church experience that is no longer church as you know it. It's no longer church as your wife knows it. It's no longer church as your children know it. Very good. Any other concerns that are on your mind? Yes, sir. Finances. Are you going to be poor the rest of your life? Is that what you mean? Financing your church?
No, for planter. Do you have enough money?
Yeah. That's very good. Yeah, that's a big concern. Yep. It's a very big concern. Are you going to have income for your family? Yeah. Especially as your family changes and grows and those types of things. So that's great. We could go on. So there's a lot of concerns. So I'm going to share a couple stories with you here in a minute. But the next slide says we're going to cover in this session 5 major spousal and family issues that are especially relevant. So I think some of the things that you just shared are actually going to show up in some of these slides. But the first one we want to talk about is the calling. Okay, we sort of got introduced to that topic. We'll probably talk about that a lot as we go through this whole seminar. But a shared calling from God with your wife. This provides fuel for the long term. I'm just going to read it quickly. Your church planting is really a team effort. Church planting is a matter of faith, and church planting requires faith regarding finances. Okay? So it's a shared calling. As a church planter, you might be very convinced of your calling, and you're just moving ahead. But have you talked to your wife to see if she really has the same calling in her heart and on her mind as she's been praying about? Have you even asked about this kind of a question? Because it really is a team effort. And, we have to be united as a husband and wife in whatever the calling is that God has for us and our marriage and our family and our ministry together. So let me just share a couple stories with you. So I shared yesterday that I pastored a restart, a replant, a revitalized type of a church, and we were next to nothing, and we built it way back up and did a lot of things. But one of the things we wanted to do was become a parent church or a mother church, okay? And so we searched and found a church planting couple, young couple with 2 young children at the time. And we were really excited about this man. His name is Israel, actually. So that's his name, Israel. And he's not Jewish, though, but that's his name, Israel. And he's a great guy. Loved the Lord, sound in doctrine, great experiences in church. And his wife, Becky, just a sweet, wonderful person. Great people. I wanted them to be on my team so badly. This would be wonderful to work with them to plant a daughter church in our valley. And so, Israel and Becky together went to a training, this exact training that you're in right now. They went together. That was really important because husband and wife need to understand things together. I also went with them because I was going to be I'm the pastor of the mother church, so I need to understand what they're going through and how I can best help them and coach them through the process. So we went to this exact seminar, and we were all really excited about the church planting. We did things like we looked at the community. They were doing a really good job of assessing where to plant the church, what their target audience was going to be, all these types of things. But we could all sense, myself, my wife, Israel, Becky, that Israel had a real strong sense in his mind and heart. Yeah, I want to plant this church with Daniel. I want to plant this church in this area. I've been doing all the research. I've got all these creative ideas how to reach the community. But at the same time, Becky is sort of withdrawing from the conversations and is starting to realize, I don't know about this. And upon further reflection and dialogue, we had them over for lunch and talked through these things. Her biggest concern was, I don't know if I really want to raise my children in that community, in that culture. Because she was used to a different culture, and she really wanted to raise her children in a very specific way. Now, you might think that that's unspiritual. I don't think it is. I think it's just confronting reality. The spiritual part is how you deal with it. And so after a while, they realized they told me no. So they said, no, we don't believe God is calling us now to plant a church in that community. Well, the story gets even better because after, he ended up being an associate pastor for a while in another larger church, but then about 3 years ago, God called him to plant a church in a community that his wife felt comfortable in raising their children in this area. And this is North Fullerton, Southern California, and they're doing a wonderful job planting a church down there. In fact, just out of the blue, 2 days before I got on the plane to come to Europe, Israel called me on the phone to talk about his church plant and how they had merged with this other church, and there's all these things going on, and just how God has been blessing it and some of the challenges he's going through. It was sort of an impromptu coaching session. And it's just such a wonderful celebration to realize that they were sensitive enough to God's leading, sensitive enough to one another as husband and wife, to say no at the right time so that they could say yes at the right time. And God is really blessing their ministry. So sometimes that happens, and you need to process that. And sometimes the issue, we shouldn't gloss over those kinds of thoughts in our spouse's wife, especially I'm talking about the husband's certain and the wife is not certain, but we can fail and gloss over it by saying, well, you don't have enough faith, honey, right? Or hey, I'm called and I'm the husband, and you're called to follow me, right? Or we might say things, well, we felt called, we've prayed about this all the time, so maybe this is just an attack of the evil one, and we just need to be obedient to the call, right? And so we can utilize faith language to really mess ourselves up. And so we need to process and think through these things. Let me tell you another story. So my major partner in India, he's Indian, his name is Mang, and his wife is Boinu, and they're actually tribal people near the Burma border. And they were considering moving to an urban, an urban town, major city that has about a dozen universities in it. And so that's a big cultural shift, they're a young couple, they have 4 young children at the time, but they processed it together the whole way. And they thought about what's it going to be like to leave our family, which is a much bigger deal in their cultural context, to go move to a city. And we don't know how to live in a city. And they may not like us in the city. And what about the university students? They're very different than us. I mean, we went to university, but that was a while ago. And so as they processed it together, they were able to come to the conclusion, and they faithfully discussed with one another what their concerns were. Where are our kids going to go to school? How are we going to afford the school? What about when our parents, this is a much bigger issue in this culture, what about our parents when they get older? How are we going to deal with this? This is a long ways away. But in the end, they decided, yes, God was definitely calling to this city, and they moved to that city, and in the first year, they planted 14 churches in 1 year. And he's just a great church planter, and his wife's a wonderful family. But the thing I wanted to emphasize again is they processed it together as husband and wife and understood that God's calling on them for ministry has to be something that's a shared calling. So that's really important. The second thing, the second major aspect is an agreement regarding roles. So there are stereotypical expectations in church planting, not just in the established church, but in new churches even. People have expectations. In fact, you have them on yourselves even, about what is the role of the planter and what's the role of the wife. And clarifying the wife's role is going to protect her, and it's going to free her up to do the things that God has called her to do. So in talking about the wife's role, it's best when she ministers according to her own gifts and passions. So again, I want to hear from you a little bit. So help me understand church planting in the Slovak culture. What are the expectations, the stereotypical expectations on the roles of a planter and his wife in church planting? What are they? They might come from the culture, they might come from your previous church. They might come from your denomination. They impose them on you. Whatever. What are they? What's a church planting wife do? Milan, you're laughing. Huh? What's a church planting wife supposed to do?
Well, I would say that one of the stereotypes is that it's pretty patriarchal.
Okay. And how does that show itself?
And basically, the man is the church planter, and the wife is the background.
In the background. Okay. Good. Anyone want to add to that? Fill the picture out for me. What are some of the other stereotypes?
The husband is the president,
Uh-huh.
and the lady is deciding, decision maker.
The husband's the president, because everybody needs a president, right? Yeah. So the husband's the president and the wife's like the prime minister?
No,
Oh.
she's not that visible.
Oh, she's not visible.
She just makes the decisions in the back.
She makes the decision in the background. Okay. Must be true. People are laughing. Okay. Anything else to add to this picture? What are the expectations upon the man, even? Yes, Steve.
Stereotypes in your culture, so they could have some illustration.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you my story. So when I went to this, you can think about that on your own. We'll just move on. But I'll tell you the story about stereotypes for us. So they vary a lot by region in our society, and they vary a lot by the age of the church and the denominations that you're in. But when I decided to take this replant situation out in California, we were moving from the middle of our country to the very edge of our country in a very progressive place. And but nonetheless, there were expectations, and when I was interviewing for the job, so to speak, type of thing, I knew there were unwritten rules about this, so I made them clarify what they expected of my wife. So my wife's name's Linda. So I said, well, they asked, first of all, this is a sneaky question. They always ask, so what are your wife's gifts? They don't really care. I mean, they just want to know so they can use her, right, to do things. But, so I just give them standard answers on that kind of thing, And then I simply ask, so what do you expect my wife to do? What are your expectations for her? And they, of course, say, oh, we don't have any expectations, which is a lie. Of course they have expectations, right? Everybody has expectations. So, but anyway, in the course of the conversation, a typical thing might be they would expect her to run women's ministries, run the children's ministries, play the piano, do finances at the church, whatever it might be. There's a whole list of things, right? And so I just made it really clear to them. I said, you've met my wife. She's a wonderful woman, but she will not do what you tell her to do. Because, my wife will do what she wants to do. And my wife's a very strong woman, very godly woman, but she knows what her gifts are and what her passions are and how she can best support me and best support the church and best empower other people to lead rather than taking it all on herself. She's not going to let other people do that to her. And so I just said, she's going to do what she wants and she'll tell you when she's ready. And I said, and if you have a list of expectations, you can give them to us with a salary package attached. So if you want to double my salary, you can get 2, because churches in America often think, oh, we get 2 for 1. Isn't it great? His wife is so good at all these things. It's like, nope, you don't get 2 for 1. If you want 2, you can pay for 2. So anyway, that ended the discussion. We had a very long and healthy and happy relationship because the boundaries were clear. But it's very important to discuss those types of things. And I think it's even more important as a husband and wife going in, realizing even if the culture doesn't tell you what they are, they're there. There are expectations on you. And it's good to discuss them together as a husband and wife, because how are you going to make decisions? You need to be settled in your mind what the limits are going to be for your wife and what she's going to do, what she's not going to do. What are her gifts? How is she going to minister best within her giftedness? And what anxieties does she have about that? I think that's a very important question to talk to your wife about is, what is she worried about as she walks into this new adventure? So I think you'd be surprised if you ask. So anyway, so some good things there. Just to an agreement regarding roles is another thing. A shared calling is the first thing. The second major thing in the family is that you have an agreement between the two of you on what the roles are going to be. Because, Satan's first attack is going to be on your marriage. And it's going to be causing disagreement in your marriage, frustration, those types of things. So it's really important to talk through these things in advance so that you're prepared for further conversation when it actually happens. So third, appropriate boundaries. We sort of talked briefly about this, but you need to take time for your family and protect the time with your family. So my question to you would be, you've probably already been in ministry for a while. Maybe it's not professional paid ministry, but you've been doing ministry at your church, most likely, if you're going to be going on and becoming a church planter. How do you balance that now? How do you balance your time? Somebody brought up earlier, how do you balance your time between your family and your ministry right now? Because how you balance it now is probably going to be how you attempt to balance it when you're planting a church. Is it working well for you? Maybe it is. That's great. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's something that needs some attention. Because you need to know what your default is going to be. You're going to default to what you're currently doing. And how do you resolve conflict between the two of you over these time issues? It's like, honey, the kids really need you. You're never around at bedtime. Which is more important, this church or me? These types of things can come up at the end of a very frustrating day or week or years. But how are you going to resolve these kinds of conflicts? So one of the ways that my wife and I did it is that we've been very faithful on a couple things that have really, really helped us over the years. And one is we always have a weekly date night, okay? So we still date each other even after 30 years of marriage coming up on here. So every Thursday night, date night. There's a board meeting at church? Oh, too bad. I'm on a date with my wife. Have a great time, guys. You can't make any decisions without me, though. But we'll talk about that on Friday. But we're very, very deliberate about that. Even today, she cannot schedule anything on a Thursday night. I cannot schedule anything on a Thursday night unless there's mutual agreement on something that's extremely important that has to happen. And then we'll reschedule our date night. But that rarely happens, maybe 5% of the time. So we've been doing that for all these years. It's been a great encouragement to our children, actually, to see mom and dad prioritize their marriage and their relationship. So that's one thing. But then for the kids, especially when they're young, remember, I think I might have told you, maybe not, but we have 6 children. And so when we moved out to this church replant experience, we had 4 girls, and my wife was 8 months pregnant with our first son. And so we wanted to get out there and have the baby out there rather than having to bring a baby with us. But we took every Friday. Friday was my day off as a pastor, as a church replant pastor type guy. So Friday, I never scheduled anything either. So I got Thursday night off, and I got Friday off. That was awesome. So Thursday night, go out, have a great dinner with my wife, do whatever we're going to do. And then the next day, it's family day. And so the kids always look forward to that. We'd go explore nature. We love to hike and camp and go to the beach and do those types of things, go to movies, whatever we want to do. But so my children didn't feel neglected, even though the pressures were really strong and it seems like dad's gone a lot, doing things. My kids were able to see that they were important too. And they're just as important, actually more important than the church itself and those people. And so that was really important. Another question here is, how do you want to use your home? Your wife might have a different idea of how many people she wants in your home, how often during the week than you do. You might think, oh, this is great. We're going to have these evangelistic parties at our house every night, and your wife's like exhausted cleaning up the mess because you guys don't clean up after yourselves or whatever the story might be. But you've got to have an agreement on how we're going to use our home. How are we going to use those resources? How are we going to entertain? Also, next point on number 3 here is dealing with criticism. Protect your family, especially your children, from church problems and church conflicts and church criticisms. So how are you going to handle criticism? Because you're going to be criticized, right, all the time. So that's just life. And ministry is more so. And how are you going to handle your own critical attitudes? That's even more important. In fact, sort of interesting to talk to your kids after they've grown up and you sort of ask them, so how did we handle critical attitudes toward the church, because as a pastor, sometimes you don't have the nicest things to say about your own church. But, do you talk about that in front of your kids or not? You shouldn't, right? Of course. So you got to be very careful about when and how you're going to process the criticism, whether it's coming from your team or whether it's coming from the wider church or wherever it's coming from. How are you going to do that in your family? And then third, attitudes are contagious, especially with children. So don't criticize others, especially other leaders, in front of children. So don't talk bad about, elder so-and-so or this other person on our church plant who's supposed to be leading the worship, but, he doesn't do this or whatever. So you don't want to criticize that. You have to have a place, though, where you're going to process it with your wife, right? Because you want to come home, you want to share things, but you need a place that's private, and how you can process that and process it in a spiritual way and pray together about it and move on and protect your children so that they actually come away with a positive experience. Hey, church planting is fun, rather than church planting almost killed my dad. Church planting destroyed our family. You don't want that to be your legacy. So, those are things to think about in advance. Appropriate boundaries is number 3. So where are you going to draw the lines? Okay. So calling has to be shared, number 1. 2, there have to be agreement in roles. 3, appropriate boundaries should be set. There are 5. Number 4, though, is modeling family life. In a church plant, you have unique opportunities to let people know you and know your family well. They can learn from how you live and you love your family. So we have an expression in the United States, maybe you have something similar, where the pastor basically lives in a fishbowl, right? You understand that and what that means? So in a fishbowl is usually made of glass, right? And the fish are just in the bowl, and you watch them swim around, right, all the time. So a pastor and his family are like living in a fishbowl, because people are always in your stuff, in your business, in your life, looking at you, examining you, analyzing you, how you do things, right? So that's life. So that's what you signed up for. You can also show your children how they can serve as a family as well. And, what do your children, especially if you have teenagers, what do your children think about this whole church planting adventure? In fact, I've run into a number of church planners, and I was probably guilty of this myself, is I just assumed that my children knew what I was doing. Church planners, sometimes as a dad, you can just assume, my kids know what we're doing. We're planting this church. But have you sat down and shared with them your calling? And a lot of times, because children love to hear the story of your calling, because it's their calling too, and they're a part of that. Think through, it's not just you, and it's not just you and your wife, but what do your kids get to do? What do they get to do in the church plant? Even if they're 5 years old, give them an assignment. They would love it. They can be a part of the adventure too. Somebody mentioned earlier about this is going to be a different experience, because we used to be a part of a nice large youth group with great music and trips and stuff. Now it's going to be like 5 of us in youth group with no youth pastor, So that can be really discouraging to young adults like that, or young teenagers. But maybe you could give them a vision for guess what? You get to build it. You get to build the youth group, And so you can bring them in on the vision as well. So thinking through not only what you need to protect them from, but it's not just a negative thing. It's we don't want to destroy our family, but how can you involve them in the actual mission of what you're doing? And the more kids you have, the more workers you have. Steve.
Yeah, you just brought to mind an interesting story about the kids' perception of the church planter. My children, when we planted our first church, were 4 and 6. Daughter 6, son 4. And they were playing house. They were playing like they were a family. And of course, the daughter was the mother, and my son was the father. And my wife came in and asked them what they were doing. And they said, we're just doing the same things you guys do. Elizabeth is going off to work, and I'm going to sit here and read.
That's a good story, yes. Thank you. Number 5, Marriage, and then we're going to do some work here. Okay, so marriage relationships need to be marked by open communication and healthy conflict resolution. And of course, many of us have been to marriage conferences. Some of us have probably taught at marriage conferences, and the list goes on and on and on, right? But these are two obviously very crucial things. So I'd really encourage you to think about what your marriage's strengths are. What are the strengths of your marriage? I mean, people often say, well, what are the struggle points? Yeah, that's an important question too, but I think it's less important. I think the more important question is, what are your strengths in your marriage? Because those are the things that you're going to rely upon. Those are your resources to get you through the difficult times together. And you do have strengths in your marriage. I mean, you love each other, you got married, you've raised kids together, whatever stage you're in. There are things about your marriage other people look at and it's like, oh, I wish I had that in my marriage. So what are those strengths? And think through those things. And then anticipate, of course, the challenges. What's going to happen when we go into the church planting venture together. And you know what? Those challenges are going to be the same challenges you currently have in your marriage relationship. They're not going to be any different. They're the same ones. So if you struggle, with being open with one another in now, well, it's just going to be the same struggle when you move. It'll just be even worse. Okay, so if you have trouble resolving conflict, now you should probably get some training on that, because it's just going to get more conflict that you have to resolve later. And so think about your strengths, but then also understand that you're going to have challenges and you're going to be challenged all the time. And then also I would want to add a third thing, and that is, what plans for growth are you pursuing in your marriage? Right? So my kids are now getting at the marrying age. And so my wife and I are just like dumping all these resources on our kids, to say, hey, you should read this book, you should read this book. But, good marriages just don't happen. Like some people will say, like, oh, I wish I had a marriage like you have. And it's like, well, it's not that easy. I mean, we've been working at it for 30 years. What makes you think that you just sort of, marriages are either good or they're bad? They're not. It's like parenting. Oh, your kids are good. Well, it's like, what does that mean? It's like, we just got lucky, but we've been working hard on parenting. Of course they're good kids because we worked at it, right? And it's like, oh, our kids are so bad. It's like, well, maybe you should work harder, as a parent. So, I mean, there's other ways to look at it. So, but marriage is something you work on your whole life. And so another thing that my wife and I have done is we've always, every year, once a year, we go to a marriage conference. So, in the early years, we usually went to the Family Life Conference put on by Campus Crusade for Christ. That was one of our favorite ones. Maybe some of you have been to those. It's a very popular one. And just to grow in our marriage. Even though we've been married 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, there's always places to grow. And then we sort of got tired of those. So then we made up our own. So then we sort of, we knew how to do it, right? So we made up our own marriage retreats for just the two of us. So we actually had our own agenda, and we'd go off for a weekend and we would just work through, the things we think we need to work on in our marriage and grow on, and parenting and all these types of things. And then other times in our marriage, we would be actively reading a book together to discuss on marriage. And there's so many good books out there and resources on quality Christian marriage. And so that helps us continue to grow and to continue to learn, because you know what? You can be a better husband than you are today. You can be a better wife. You can be a better mother. You can be a better father. And it's a really exciting journey if you engage that opportunity to really grow. And if you're growing as a couple, just think about what the witness that gives to the people you're trying to reach with the gospel, and to your own team that you're working with. It's a wonderful testimony. So as you think about your family going into church planting, and again, if you're not thinking you're exactly going into church planting, imagine you are, because you're going to do a little exercise here in a second. So imagine that you're going to go plant a church, okay? And you got to think through these things. Do we have a shared calling? How do we find that out? What about appropriate boundaries and agreeing on our roles, and what we want our family to look like, and what we want our marriage relationship to really look like? Those are so crucial. And let me just throw a few other things out there. And then we're going to work on this map discussion. So you'll see that. And there's going to be two questions I want you to think about. One is for the couples together. And if your spouse isn't here with you, then you can just do the exercise by yourself, okay? So one is for couples. So if you're both here, then you need to do it together. If your spouse is not here or you're not married, you can do it by yourself, okay? And then the second exercise is for couples and planter pairs. So in other words, if your team is here, work as a team on the second one, okay? So the first one is either as husband and wife or by yourself, and the second exercise is going to be in your group, okay, your team, if your team is here. If your team's not here, then you do it by yourself or with your spouse, okay? So, but let me just throw out a few other things as you're turning to that page. And I'm going to give you some significant time in this, okay? So you're going to have 10 minutes, 9 minutes. You're going to have 9 minutes in each of those, okay? And I'll time you. So, but anyway, let me just read some things. So you've heard a little bit about how there's an assessment process out there, right? So this is basic training. This is the B of the ABCs. There's the A, the assessment piece, and there's the C, the coaching piece. So in the assessment piece, one of the things that's really crucial in assessing a church planner's readiness is the relationship of their marriage. And so here's some statements that come directly from the assessment tool. Some of you may have taken it and remember, some of you may have not. But my wife agrees with and shares my church planting call. My wife knows my church planting vision as well as I do. My wife and I agree upon our respective roles in a new church plant. I am able to balance the demands of ministry and marriage. My wife and I do not have any relationship issues that will negatively impact a new church plant. My wife and I agree upon how we're going to use our home to plant a church. My wife has no anxieties about church planting. My wife and I have strong communication and intimacy so that we're able to share our hearts with one another in all circumstances. My wife and I have no anxieties about raising our children in a new church plant at this stage in our lives. My wife and I have regularly scheduled times when we get away by ourselves. So those are the questions that we use in the assessment. And then, of course, in the interview process, those are sort of reviewed with a little bit deeper probing questions to help a church planting couple really understand how they're doing in their marriage and being supportive of one another in this new adventure. Okay, so everyone should understand the instructions. So you turn to your MAP, and I have a timer up here, okay? So don't leave the room. It's not bathroom break yet. It's not snack break yet, okay? So I'll tell you when that time is. So you have 9 minutes. Anybody have any questions about what we're doing now? Is it very clear?
What page?
I don't know what page.
There's no separate pages, just the map in the slide.
Okay, so it's in the next slide? Ah, there we go. Page, just look at the screen. Oh, what happened? That's it? Okay, so there it is. It's up on the screen. So you can just talk, take notes. You got 9 minutes to discuss the first question. Go ahead.